ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi there, it's PK from the new podcast Politics Now. Sam Hawley will be with you in a second for ABC News Daily, but I just want to tell you about my new podcast Politics Now. As news breaks, we'll bring you the latest analysis in your feed. It's called Politics Now and you can find us on the ABC Listen app.
If Peter Dutton wins the election, he wants to appoint his own Elon Musk to cut government spending. So, what will be on the chopping block? And do Australians really want a Trump-style DOGE? Today, Mark Kenny, Director of the Australian Studies Institute at the ANU, on whether slashing the public service really saves money in the end. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Mark, in the US they have Elon Musk, and here soon we could have Jacinta Nampijinpa Price taking a wrecking ball to anything she considers wasteful spending in the government.
The woman who championed the no vote getting promoted to the newly created job of Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency.
Australians want to cut the waste. They want to make sure that outcomes are coming to life with the way in which taxpayer dollars are being spent.
Jacinta has not just the ability and the intellect, but the real drive to be able to find the efficiency so that we can stop wasting taxpayers' money.
What do you make of that?
It is interesting, isn't it? We see these crossovers. There's a lot of cross-fertilisation of ideas in democratic politics these days. I suppose it's the globalisation of strategy and policy and election campaigning and messaging. There's quite a parallel here, obviously, with Musk in terms of the name of the department and the general brief. I think it's interesting that Peter Dutton has gone down this path. He's been enthusiastic about some aspects of Trumpism and I think also eager to distance himself from some other aspects, quite wisely, I suspect. So we'll have to see how this plays out.
So Elon Musk heads up DOGE in the US, that's the Department of Government Efficiency, and Peter Dutton wants Jacinta to be the Minister for Government Efficiency here, if, of course, he wins the election. By the way, Mark, this was an idea, of course, that the mining magnate and billionaire Gina Rinehart really liked, wasn't it?
It was, and she's a particular enthusiast for Donald Trump. I think was at the Trump election party, certainly at the inauguration. She's very enthusiastic about sort of adopting a whole lot of aspects of Trumpism and the kind of nativist and nationalist type policies that Trump is pursuing. But my sense is that the parliamentary system puts a considerable brake on the sort of autonomy and scope and enthusiasm that a minister for government efficiency could wield, as compared to, say, the presidential system where Musk seems to have been given a pretty clear brief and a whole lot of room to just do what he likes.
So let's discuss what we know about the cuts that could be made so far. They relate, of course, Mark, to the public service, don't they?
They do. The would-be Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, believes that he can save up to $6 billion a year by cutting into the public service.
We've identified, as you know, scaling back of the public service, which has grown phenomenally under the Labor Party. 36,000 additional public servants. That's at a cost of $6 billion a year, or $24 billion over the forward estimates.
Whether that's actually realisable saving or not, I don't know, but election campaigns are for putting forward propositions. They're not necessarily great places for testing them, working out whether they actually would work or not. Hopefully they'll be examined in some sort of detail, but at the end of the day, this is a kind of an easy political lever to pull to talk about government efficiency and to talk about making savings that will fund other things in the government rather than what neither side ever seems too keen on talking about, which is actually increasing revenue by raising taxes.
If you're saving $24 billion plus over the forward estimates with the public servants, that's money that you can either use to pay off debt or you can use to put downward pressure on inflation.
He also says he wants all the public servants back to the office full-time, and he has taken aim also at advisors in the public sector. It all sounds rather familiar, similar to what Trump has brought in.
There are public servants at the moment in Canberra who are refusing to go back to work, and they're being paid in some cases over $200,000 a year. Positions have been advertised that include those required for cultural diversity and inclusion advisor positions, change managers. But such positions, as I say, do nothing to improve the lives of everyday Australians.
But while it does sound familiar, it's not that uncommon, is it, for a coalition government to cut the public service?
No, it's not unusual. What's unusual is for it to actually make much in the way of savings. As I say, it's an easy kind of strategy. It rolls off the tongue pretty well. It sits quite comfortably with Conservatives who are supposed to be about small government and efficiency and the like.
Federal Treasurer Peter Costello has confirmed that more public sector jobs will go than promised before the election.
Tony Abbott took the surprising step of outlining billions of dollars in financial cuts and plans to pare back the public service.
It's important to be sure that government is doing only those things that people can't do for themselves.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says $2.7 billion will be shaved from departmental expenditures.
Today, what I'm here to do is to announce changes to the structure of the Australian Public Service to ensure that services that Australians rely on are delivered more efficiently and more effectively.
But in the past, we've seen that it can have both material effects in terms of the reduction in services, and that can quite dramatically alter its political attractiveness on an ongoing basis. You know, service personnel, people who are on the front line of dealing with the public, are just not there anymore, and people find themselves having to deal with government through websites and through dealing with robots and the like. Then all gets very difficult.
And we saw, didn't we, what happened in Veterans Affairs when Scott Morrison took an axe to that department. The result was frankly devastating.
That's right.
The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide has heard how the federal government struggled to process a backlog of tens of thousands of veterans' compensation claims. Now,
there were just not enough staff to process their claims, and the delays really caused a great deal of huge delays, caused great mental and physical health problems for a lot of them. And the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide has found that.
That's politically a disaster, really, particularly for a Conservative government, for any government really, though, to be making life harder for veterans who are reliant on the Department of Veterans Affairs for their services, their upkeep, to be facing the sorts of hardships that they were facing. We're seeing a bit of this in the US, incidentally. Already, people finding out that this notion of making government more efficient, just simply cutting jobs and taking the axe to the public sector and so forth, it has material implications for people who are reliant on their contact with government and those services. And some of those people are the most vulnerable in the community. And in the case of veterans, people who've given their life to the service of the country, given their careers to it, and now find themselves powerless and suffering as a result. The other thing that is a problem for this is that a lot of functions that the public service undertakes, if you cut them out, you still need to provide those functions. And we saw, as the National Audit Office found, in the last year of the Morrison government, there was somewhere in the order of $20 billion spent on consultants and contract services provided to the government. Now, not all of that is as a result of public service cuts, but we know that a lot of these big consultant firms were absolutely making a mozza out of winning these contracts to provide services. So does the taxpayer end up better off? That's a debate.
Yeah, and of course we know now that this outsourcing of government work, it does come with a risk, right? Because we had the case of PwC.
Well, the PwC case was absolutely horrendous because what we actually had was PwC involved in working with the tax office, using that confidential information to provide advice for its other gold plate clients, big corporates, on how to avoid tax, in what changes were coming and what they would need to do in order to avoid paid tax. It was an absolutely outrageous breach of their legal requirement for confidentiality, and just showed that there is something to be said for having a professional, independent public service that isn't reliant on compromised private sector operators, as was the case there.
And since the Labor government has been elected, it's reversed that spending on consultants. But it just seems like it's this cycle. Coalition government hires more consultants and then the Labor government puts more public servants back into place. It's a vicious circle. When does it end?
It is a vicious circle. Look, I think one of the things to say about this is that there ought to always be, on an ongoing basis, a debate about the size of the public service, a debate about the efficiency, whether we get value for money for it. There's nothing in and of itself illegitimate about that process. We would expect our governments to not be employing more public servants than is required simply because they're spending our money rather than their own.
And the thing is, Mark, an efficient public service is what, I presume, the majority of Australians actually want.
That's what I think the coalition is tapping into here. But on the other side, it's just too easy to be demonising the public service all the time and to be suggesting that that's where you're going to make these big savings. You know, oppositions need to go to elections proposing policy. We haven't seen much in the way of substantive policy from Peter Dutton yet, but presumably he will be proposing things that cost money, and some of that will be supposedly paid for by the savings made out of cutting the public service. That raises the question, what implications does that have for the operation of government? And the other question, is there actually a saving here at all, or is this just a cheap political line? The political side of this, you know, from Peter Dutton's point of view, we've talked about why he might go about this, but it doesn't come without risks, both in terms of that diminution of services to people, but also the sense that our public service is not loathed in the way that it might be in the US, where Donald Trump for a long time has been talking about draining the swamp.
We are draining the swamp. It's very simple. And the days of rule by unelected bureaucrats are over.
The swamp effectively being the Washington public service and sort of political community. We don't have that kind of antipathy towards our government or our public institutions in this country, and I think it's a good thing that we don't import it.
Yeah, so you think it might not be a vote winner here particularly?
I don't think it's going to be a huge vote winner. I do think in Australia people believe that governments should be supporting them during times of difficulty. That, I think, is an institutional and cultural difference between Australia and the US in particular, and probably some other countries as well. It's a constructive relationship that we have. We expect our governments to look after us. We saw that during the COVID pandemic, for example. You know, the immediate reaction as that dawned, as it became clear that we were dealing with a sort of a global health emergency, was Australians looked to their government and said, okay, what are you going to do? What do we need to do? Please solve this. And Australians were, by and large, much more cooperative in that process, taking whatever measures were necessary to protect us and having the government do that, than was the case in some other places. And I think that is a institutional and cultural strength in Australia that we'd be worse off if we allowed to be diminished in any material way.
So we might not be ready, Mark, for our own DOGE.
I don't think so. And as I say, I think the cabinet process in itself and the Westminster system, I think these things make it a bit different from a president who is fond of executive orders and who is essentially governing almost by himself. He's stacked his own cabinet with believers, you know, with sycophants essentially. But I don't think we're going to see the same sort of thing. I think Peter Dutton wants the political dividend from talking about this, but the details of it would be less dramatic, one imagines, than we see in the US.
Mark Kenny is the Director of the Australian Studies Institute at the ANU. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Sam Dunn. Audio production by Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. To get in touch with the team, please email us on ABC News Daily at abc.net.au. Thanks for listening.